Good morning. It's good to be with you again this morning as best we can. And it's good to be here to talk about what the Lord has had to say to us this week. We have a rather appropriate subject for today. We're going to talk about fear. I've seen a little fear this week. I've seen some last week and the week before. And it seems to be running rampant among us and over the television and everywhere I look. So I want to talk about it just a little bit this morning. I'm going to look at two angles. One is to fear, the other one is to fear not. And you have to do both of those at the same time. Because as the Lord is speaking to Satan in the book of Job, chapter 1, verse 8, he says, "And the Lord said to Satan, Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for no reason?" No, Job had reason to fear God in this sense that God asked us to fear him. We are to fear God and keep his commandments in Deuteronomy. Again, in Ecclesiastes, virtually the same statement. And so there is that reverent fear for God that we all have. And that will be with us forever and ever. And that's a healthy fear. A reverence of God, recognizing his majesty, his power, his dominion, and recognizing that we are in his hands each day. So when we look at that side of fear, that's the healthy side of fear. The other side of fear is that fear that troubles human souls and even our daily lives. There is a fear test, and I hope we don't have to take it. But one of the strongest prophets in the Old Testament, Prophet Elijah, faced that fear. Elijah was a prophet that in 1 Kings chapter 18 holds this big showdown with the prophets of Baal and ends up killing all these prophets. These prophets, as it turns out, had friends in high places. And so chapter 19 of 1 Kings 19, chapter 1, verse 1 says, Ahab told Jezebel, Ahab is the king, and Jezebel is the queen, that wicked queen with a reputation that rings down through our day. And so Ahab the king tells his wife, the evil Jezebel, all that Elijah had done to her prophets and how he had killed them all with the sword. Then Jezebel sends a messenger over to Elijah. And here's the message in 1 Kings 19, verse 2. This message said, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." The message she's sending is that she needs to have Elijah dead by this time tomorrow. Naturally, in verse 3, we find a reaction, much like we would probably have in the same circumstance. Verse 3 says, "Then he was afraid, and he arose, and he ran for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there." Elijah's life is turned upside down. Elijah's life has taken a sudden turn from that great victory over those 450 prophets of Baal to this next day when he's running for his life. And verse 4 says, "But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree, and he asked that he might die, saying, 'It is enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers.'" We can somewhat sympathize with Elijah in this condition. And Elijah is struggling. Next few verses talks about a cake being prepared for him and a drink 2 days in a row, because he's about to embark on a 40-day journey. That's how long it took to travel by foot 200 miles back in those days. So as he travels, verse 9 says, "There he came to a cave and lodged in it." I like caves a little bit. We've been in caves in Carlsbad, New Mexico, where when they turn the lights off, you've never seen a darker time than that. There's not one proton of light in that whole big area. Went in a cave in Chattanooga where you had to carry a lantern because there was no lights in the cave. And so we cautiously went back maybe 50, 100 yards into that cave, and then scrambled back out again because, what can go wrong? Your lantern goes out, someone drops their lantern, who knows? But Elijah has found this cave, and he's found security and comfort in this cave because surely nobody can find him there. However, the last part of that verse says, "And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?'" It's very difficult to hide from the Lord. It's very difficult for him to not remind you that he's there. And so Elijah tells him this very sad story. "Been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel," whom he's trying to preach to. "The people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And even I only am left, and they seek my life to take it away." Elijah is indeed in a very, very tough spot. But there's a lot more to this story than just that, and it goes on to continue. But the one thing that always gets our attention, as I'm sure it did when Elijah hears these words from the Lord, and you see this occur all in the New Testament and Old Testament. An angel of God steps in front of someone, and as we've said many times in class before, when that angel steps in front of you, what does he always say? He always says, "Do not be afraid." Too late, Ethel. Too late, because by then, when an angel steps in front of you, your best human reaction is, "I'm terrified." And so we find people throughout the Bible face these situations and face these problems. Matthew chapter 1, verse 20, there's a fellow here, betrothed to be married, getting ready to be married, discovers that his fiancée, whom he thought was perfectly pure, is pregnant. And he has to give this some serious thought. These are life-changing events. But an angel of the Lord came to him in a dream, saying, "Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. And so Joseph did take Mary as a wife, and from that marriage, baby Jesus comes into this world. And so people have real reasons to be feared. Jesus had a man come one time who had a sick child. There's nothing more frightening than a sick child, especially if it's serious illness. And so Jesus sees the problem, and what's his first word? Do not fear. Only believe, and she will be well. And so Jesus comes to that situation. Do not fear, he says. And so we compare that to some of our situations and put that in the back of our head. And there's a little maneuver we might need to make every now and then. Do not fear. 1 Peter chapter 3, here's one that's even tougher. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. I can personally say that I have never feared anything that wasn't frightening. But Peter is writing here, do not fear anything that is frightening. It seems to be going totally against human nature. And those things that you face may be terribly frightening. In Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10, the letter to the church at Smyrna says, do not fear. That's the beginning. Do not fear what you're about to suffer. Oh, he says, behold, the devil is about to throw some of you in prison. In Roman days, that was a fearful thing. It's no easy thing today, but then it was a fearful thing. But the letter to the Christians in Smyrna was, do not fear. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. So we see this principle. Be faithful, fear God, do not fear anything else. Can we put it into practice? Well, that might be another story. Luke chapter 8, verse 22. One day he got into a boat with his disciples. This is Jesus. And he said to them, let us go across to the other side of the lake. So they set out, and as they sailed, he fell asleep. And a windstorm came down on the lake, and they were filling with water and were in danger. You ever been on a large lake in rough weather? In a canoe? It can be frightening. But he says to them, and they went to him saying, Master, Master, we are perishing. And he woke and rebuked the wind and the raging waves, and they ceased, and there was calm. Now, in the calm, what does he say? Now it's perfectly calm, still, peaceful. And Jesus says to them, where is your faith? And they were afraid, and they marveled, saying to one another, who then is this, that he commands even winds and waters, and they obey him? Jesus said, have faith and have faith in God. Have faith in Him. It may be one thing for us to be scared in a boat that's in rough weather. But what if Jesus Christ Himself is sitting beside you in that boat? Jesus then says, you have little faith. If you've seen what I can do and yet you worry about a little water. In Revelation 21 and verse 8, there's a list of people who will be in that lake of fire with sulfur, which is the second death. Their portion will be there. And I'm going to read this list to you, not like you've read it 100 times. I'm going to read it to you backwards. I'm going to start at the end and go towards the front. And so these people who will wind up in that lake that burns with fire and sulfur will be these: liars, idolaters, sorcerers, sexually immoral, murderers, and the detestable, and the faithless. But guess what the very first one in that list was? It was the cowardly. The cowardly. I'm hoping here that God is not talking about once or twice that you really were up against it and you got scared. But I hope He's talking about those who just walk around scared all the time. And He says the cowardly will have no place in heaven. And that is quite possibly because it will be impossible to walk the face of this earth for any length of time without having some truly frightening experiences. My brother-in-law rode with me in a little twin-engine airplane one time. We'd been to the Florida Keys scuba diving, and we stopped in Tampa and refueled, and it was dark, and the weather was bad all around, getting bad. And so when we left there, the controller says, "Would you like to follow this corporate airplane in front of you who has radar?" And we said, yes. Radar is what you need on a night like this. And so when we took off, we headed due west, 270 degrees. If you've ever been to Tampa, you realize that's out to sea. That's out over the Gulf. It's dark. There's lightning on both sides. And we fly out there a ways, and then the fella turns right 90 degrees and heads due north. Okay, so far so good. Now we're headed back toward Memphis. And then after a little while, he turns right again, straight back for the state of Florida. We flew over Gainesville. As many trips as we made on that route, we never saw Gainesville in our life. And so here we are, and then we turn back north again and head towards home. And then we get out of that weather. But it was too much for my brother-in-law. And it was bad enough, but we were in pretty decent flying conditions the whole way. But he was frightened severely because he didn't have the experience that some of the rest of us had flying in weather like that. And so I hope it's not just those once or twice scared that don't make heaven. I hope it's those whose general outlook is, I'm pretty much afraid all the time. Jesus speaks to this in Luke chapter 12, verse 4. I tell you, my friends, do not fear those who kill the body, and after that have nothing more that they can do. Think about that a moment. Somebody comes up, kills you dead, you fall over, laying on the ground. Now what can they do? They can't do anything with you because you are in the hands of the living God. And so we need to realize every day, yes, there are real dangers around us. Yes, we will face them every day. But yes, we are unable to avoid all problems. And after death, yes, one of these days, one of these things is liable to take our lives. But we have no fear, because when that happens, then we are in the hands of the living God. And so Jesus says, don't be afraid. They may kill you, but after that, you're in the hands of the living God. Psalmist really summed it up in Psalms 46. These type expressions are common in many Psalms. But he says in verse 1, God is our refuge and a strength, a very present help in time of trouble. Therefore, we will not fear. Though the earth gives away, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling, we are not going to fear, because we are in the hands of the living God, no matter what. So, as we go about our lives today, keep these things in mind. God is always with us. God is our strength. And God wants us to live a long time. But we need to realize that the one thing God does not want is us walking around cowering behind every corner at every little danger. I hope that you have a good week this week. If there's anything we can do to help you in your spiritual life, if you need to be baptized or if you just need to talk, then contact us as soon as possible. Thank you very much.